Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 249 of the podcast. It is May 16th, 2016. My guest today is Steve Leuschel. He's the author of the book Lean Culture Change, Using a Daily Management System. Now, there was a guest post from Steve on the blog back in January that included an excerpt from his book about huddles. So you can find a link to that if you go to leanblog.org/249. And in this episode, Steve and I discuss a number of topics, including who his greatest influences are, the lessons he learned from Rodger Lewis, a former Toyota executive, the idea of mutual trust, PDCA cycles, daily huddles, and more. And we talk about the potential of a lean management system. Why is it so difficult to get organizations and leaders to embrace a holistic system to do that type of culture change? So before we start, I would like to thank, we have a sponsor for this episode. They are Quick Procedure. And if you go to their website, www.quikprocedure.com. Quick Procedure lets you create your procedures 400% faster. It's now available on iPad. With Quick Procedure, you don't need a PC or a camera or even a notepad. Simply open Quick Procedure and fill in the document details. Complete the details for each process step and add photos, all without leaving the process. Save time, save money with Quick Procedure. And now here's today's episode. Steve, hi. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
So, we've got a lot to talk about today. We're talking, of course, about your relatively new book, Lean Culture Change, Using a Daily Management System. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort to bring a book to fruition. So I'm curious, what was the passion behind the book? What was the story that led you to do it?
Well, years ago when I first met Rodger Lewis, who wrote the introduction, his approach to changing an organization or implementing lean is very different from what's out there in the mainstream. It's starting to get more and more mainstream, but there really wasn't a good training book to say, hey, these are the tools I think we need to use first. This is why we need to use these tools first, and this is how these different tools interconnect. So that's what drove me to write this book and also find examples about those tools that are out there that hospitals are using.
So I was going to ask you about Rodger. He wrote the introduction to the book. There are some really good videos. I'll link to those in the blog post about the episode. Tell us about his background and why you think he has, why he's developed a different perspective or a different approach.
Well, in the appendix and the preface, I go over what I believe is the theory of professionalization of lean. And when you look at the Toyota community and the lean community, I think there was a lot of individuals that came out of Toyota that learned how to do Kaizen events, that learned how to do tools. And when you look at the Kaizen event and how Toyota engaged their suppliers, most of the time it was through some type of Kaizen event activity because they had the need to solve the problem. And they already had this system in place. Rodger was one of the first few individuals that were hired at the Toyota Georgetown plant, which is a pretty neat story. I may have some of these facts wrong, but in 1986 is when they hired the majority of the leaders, and they didn't start production until 1988 or 1989. So when you look at that time to develop people, they were doing that at the same time as they were building the infrastructure. So I think his learning opportunity there was immense. And then you add that on to his years at Volkswagen prior to Toyota and his years at General Motors after Toyota. And he's just got one very, very unique experience. And he's been able to test this system and implement it over and over, not necessarily in healthcare, but in manufacturing. Really the inspiration was, how do we implement this system or adapt this system to healthcare?
Yeah, and I think it raises an interesting point that being able to do a week-long project is very different than really having a lean philosophy or mindset. The Toyota people today, Jamie Benini from TSSC, who works with suppliers and sometimes healthcare, he talks about lean being, they have this triangle diagram of tools and philosophy and management system. Why do you think it's difficult? It seems like all the people in healthcare are really hooked on the week-long rapid improvement events. Why do you think that is? And do you have some thoughts on what we can try to do about that?
Well, I think in healthcare especially, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And the rapid improvement event or the Kaizen event will yield very good results if done properly. And most of the things that have been published are about all the good things that people have done with Kaizen events. But I don't know. I'm sure that there's been studies, but I don't know any off the top of my head on the failure rate of the Kaizen event. So how many hospitals or organizations just in general tried to do this Kaizen event approach and they didn't have good results? They might have had a good plan, but they didn't have a good check, or they didn't have a good, ability to integrate it into their daily management, probably because they didn't have a daily management system that was robust enough to do so.
Well, I know at least one data point that the folks at Virginia Mason shared pretty openly a few years ago is that I think, at least in the early years of doing what they call RPIWs, it was something like a 70% rate where they said they didn't sustain the results. They were backsliding into the old way of doing things. So, going back to the old process, of course, is going to generate the old results. And they had to get better at, how they structured and planned the events. And what I see, I don't know if this is their situation. I see in healthcare a lot of people, they get to the end of the event and they say, oh, okay, well, we have our new process now. Like, well, wait a minute. During the event, you maybe had just a handful of participants. They may have tried the new process, but you haven't really fully engaged or trained everyone else in the department who needs to do that work that way. So I think, at least, and I'm curious, maybe some of you, if you've seen a similar thing, what people describe as a lack of sustainment is as much a lack of adoption.
Yeah, a lack of adoption and a lack of having the culture in place to actually sustain the event. So it's easy to get people in a room and, point out all the problems and point out what we should be doing. But then when we go back to our daily work, it's pretty difficult to convince everybody to get them engaged in improvement, because we don't just want to sustain a Kaizen event, we want to improve upon it. But it's very, very difficult to do that if the culture isn't in place.
Yeah. And in your book, it's focused again a lot on culture and the daily management system. What are some of the things that you lay out in the book as, kind of maybe some of the first steps? Let's say a healthcare system has been doing a lot of projects. They've maybe been doing a lot of training. Is there kind of a sequence that you think makes sense about where to start? Do you have to adopt the whole system all at once? I mean, it is a system, or can you kind of do things in a good progression?
Well, I think you've got to have the leadership team not just on board, but they have to be using the same tools that are used in the pilot hall. Some other organizations are calling the pilot hall a model cell. It's just I'm familiar with the language of pilot hall. That's what Rodger's been calling it for years. But you have to be able to make the system work at the top and at the bottom. And it's not about seeing waste and eliminating waste. I think that there's been a lot of books written about that, and not that I disagree that we need to see waste and eliminate it, but especially in the beginning, it is very difficult for people to see the positive. And if we can use the tools to help focus on the positive, the good things that everybody's doing, and use the tools to perpetuate the good things, that's really what the culture change is about. So how do we sequence the tools? How do we make the tools more manageable so that we just don't have this big Kaizen event, or so that we're not asking leaders or asking frontline employees or middle managers to do A3s, because an A3 is it's a complex tool with a lot of thinking that goes behind it. And to think that an organization can just start with Kaizen events or A3s, I think just either leads down a path of failure or just takes a long, long time to change the culture and get those tools working.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. There's a risk of, I think, people getting a little overwhelmed or frustrated by some of these methods. PDCA or A3 or a lot of lean concepts, I think, are deceptively simple at first glance. Then it gets difficult, and I think sometimes people get a little upset by that. But I think you also raise a good point, pointing out waste. I mean, what's logically, rationally true, and I guess I would say as a recovering engineer, it's easy to lose sight of what's rationally true might emotionally really bother somebody. I've seen people in healthcare get really emotional about waste that's either pointed out, or even when they identify it, they start feeling bad that the waste is there. They start feeling awful that they haven't been serving their patients well. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, or if you can elaborate a little more on this idea of finding the positive.
Yeah, I think, to your point that you just made, a lot of people are either they're very tied to their job, and they should be. It's probably the reason why most of us got into healthcare. And for somebody to come in and say, well, that's wasteful, they don't even, in the beginning, they don't even understand our definition of waste, and they just hear the negative. And leaders don't have a lot of time to implement, because healthcare is ever changing, and there's so many different changes going on right now that if they only have time a couple minutes a day or an hour a day, we don't want to send them out to see the waste, because like you said, it just makes everybody feel bad. So how do we send them out to see the positive? So the improvement system, or suggestion system, solution system, others call it, if we have a standard process in place to get leaders just to go and see those simple things, to encourage people, to thank them, to give them a reward, some type of recognition, and say, what else are you working on? How can I help you make this hospital better, make this organization better? So it's very positive focused, and the leader learns, the frontline employee learns, and the people in the middle also learn as well.
Yeah, and I think there's similar challenges at the top. I want to come back to something you mentioned a few minutes ago. You were talking about the management system and leadership getting started with those methods. I think sometimes senior executives are in a tough spot where for them to admit there's a new system available, there's a new way of doing things, it stings just as much. It's an admission of, the way I've been managing for 20 or 30 years is now not good enough. I mean, I think there's similar challenges there. How do you maybe address some of that from an executive perspective, getting past some of that, the emotion of it to try to embrace and practice a new way?
I think it's almost the same for executives, not exactly the same, but in essence, it's the same, because we also want them to focus on the positive, because they're also getting peer pressure from their peers, from the outside, from the board. And what can we do to, I don't want to necessarily say make them look good, but what are we doing to perpetuate the positive at the executive level as well? Because it's not all about the negative. And a lot of executives have some very, very good behavior that they can be teaching other people. And I think as lean folks around the nation and around the world, it's really our job to help find that positive behavior and help teach our executives to teach each other that positive behavior. So pretty soon it becomes an organizational standard and a norm. And then eventually those negative behaviors will go away, because they're just overwritten by the positive behaviors.
Yeah, and I mean, do you find sometimes that sometimes the positive behaviors can become a problem? Someone's greatest strength becomes a weakness. For example, you might praise an executive for, you might look at it and say, okay, you care about the organization getting good results. You're really energetic. But the negative of that is that they're jumping in, they're being bossy, they're giving people answers. There may be a flip side to that positive. Do you have any thoughts or stories about striking a balance, or maybe making sure what could be a positive doesn't become a negative?
Yeah, there's always that possibility, and that's really the role of the sensei or the lean coach. If you don't have a sensei, if the lean coach, the internal person, is able to do that, and that's why it's so important to have go and sees when you're going to the Gemba, to make sure somebody's there that's been down the path before, that you can PDCA or PDSA after the go and see and say, well, you exhibited this behavior and this is what it portrayed to that person. So what do you think you could do better next time? Like at one organization, for example, this was years and years ago, we had an executive go to the Gemba and look at an improvement and say, oh, well, we're doing this improvement system because of X, Y, and Z. And it took the focus off of that employee and off of that idea and kind of put it back on the leadership team, which I didn't think was a good thing. So we coached that person to say, hey, let's make sure that we're not talking about the improvement system and how good it is. Let's make sure we're talking about this improvement in this person and what can we do to help advance this person and advance their next idea, or standardize the improvement across the organization. So I think without that constant coaching and learning, it's difficult for the organization to advance. So that's why it's very important to have a good sensei that's been down the road before.
Yeah. Now, has Rodger Lewis played a role within your health system? With since he had been, I believe he was the general manager at Georgetown at one point has he helped mentored or become a sensei to healthcare leaders that you've been around?
I say that whenever I need to pull the end on, Rodger's the one I'm calling. So early on when I started off, I was telling him about all the training we were doing and how we were getting X percent of leaders trained and managers trained. And then he, of course, asked me a question. So how many people in the pilot hall have you trained so far? Have you done a little study to make sure that the training is getting the results that you want it to get? So he's always there to pull the end on, and I think he's a very good resource for that.
Yeah. One other question I wanted to ask about, we talk about management systems and executives. I think it's easy for even people here in the lean world to start sort of pushing a solution. We've seen something that we know is powerful, a lean management system, a lean culture, daily improvement, and we have to be careful we practice what we preach in terms of defining a problem and letting that approach be a countermeasure. How would you describe, if the executives can and should embrace a new approach? I mean, have you given thought to how do we define, and I don't know the answer here necessarily, how do we define the problem statement with executives in a way that is engaging instead of threatening in some way?
I don't know. That's a tough question. I'm not really sure how to answer that, because it really depends on where the executive team is and what their problem at hand is. Sometimes you may need to start with a different tool that you might not want to start with, or that you might not know is the best thing for the organization to capture the hearts and minds of the executives. Mm-hmm. But it just depends on where they're at. If they're focused on culture, focused on finance, or if they need help with one of those. I think it depends. I guess I really didn't answer your question there.
Well, I mean, I think that's a fair, reasonable answer to say it depends. I mean, it was a question that was maybe asking for inappropriate generalization. But I think you raise an interesting issue, though, talking about the idea of capturing hearts and minds. That lean is never just a purely logical, rational approach. I was at a patient safety conference last weekend, and a number of people were kind of talking about the theme. They were saying in healthcare, you need not just data, but you need stories. And I think stories can really help engage the hearts as well as the minds. Do you have any thoughts or experiences, or maybe you've touched on this in the book? How do we get people to care about lean instead of just I think there's cases where people have had lean forced on them, where they didn't have their hearts and minds engaged. What are your thoughts there?
I think when it comes to stories, almost everybody can tell you a horror story from their experience at a certain hospital or a loved one's experience at a hospital. But I think when we go to really try to show everybody what lean is about, show everybody what culture change is about, it's much more than just telling those horror stories, but it's telling, a patient safety story, and then what the cause was and what we did to make sure that it would never happen again. And that's really where the positive comes out, so that people can start to learn, oh, they applied this tool there, or they, thought of this countermeasure here. I think I can tweak that a little bit for my area, and it just perpetuates the positive. But if we tell horror stories without telling what we did about it and what we're going to do to make sure it never happens again, it's very difficult to perpetuate lean and perpetuate the culture.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where I was reading it the other day. Somebody was talking about you can't just point out the problem or the challenge, that'll get people stirred up without some idea of what we're going to do about it. People are going to get wound up, and it can be, I think, counterproductive. I wonder how much this happens in healthcare. There have been the studies going back to 1999 of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans. It's estimated, and that's the best they can do is estimate this, who die as the result of preventable medical errors. That's really hard for people in healthcare to stomach and even think about. I think sometimes because I think maybe people are afraid that they don't know how to solve it, so let's not get wound up about it. But it's such a serious issue.
Yeah, there's a burning platform on so many different levels in healthcare, and I think, well, I hope every executive across the nation realizes that, and I think they do. But executives need to be that buffer between what's happening externally and what's happening internally, and make sure that, again, it comes back to focusing on the positive. Sharing the positive statistics within the hospital, sharing the good things that the organization is doing to move the needle on those negative national numbers really helps get people engaged towards a common goal and see that it's working. If they don't see it's working, see that the tools or the efforts, whatever it might be, is working, it's hard to continue to perpetuate that.
One other thing you talked about in the book, and I think this maybe also ties into the idea of capturing hearts and minds, you really highlighted this idea of mutual trust. And I think, my reaction to reading that is to say, well, I think that's insightful, and that I think it often goes unsaid in lean, that in a really lean environment that mutual trust is there, and it's sort of like a fish being in water doesn't describe the water around it, it just is. Can you kind of elaborate on this idea of mutual trust, what it means, how can we try to build that, maybe as a starting point even?
Well, I think initially from a high level, mutual trust, a lot of folks look at that as we're not going to lay anybody off from improvement, but really you want to take it to the next level and say we're not going to lay anybody off, period. We're going to hold these jobs. It's about not only patient safety, employee safety, but it's about having an organization that's going to sustain over the years, so that kind of gets that out of the way, so that people can be engaged in improvement and not worried about their jobs. They're worried about the things that really matter to the organization, the patient safety, employee safety, etc. But mutual trust and respect on a daily basis gets down to, that's why we go to see improvements instead of go to see the waste. We'll eliminate the waste by going to see improvements, but it's such a subtle difference. But the connotation and the perception from the mass of the organization is very, very different if a leader goes and sees waste versus goes and sees improvements.
Well, and I think without that mutual trust, it gets difficult, because people, again, I think even if it's not intended, they take things very personally. I'm sure we've both been through situations where you're looking at a process, you're doing value stream mapping, and you're kind of identifying, is that step value or is that step non-value added? And people's bias and tendency is always to describe, well, that step's value. Well, that step's value. They're like, well, if you step back and ask, well, why is that step value? And they say, well, it's because, we have to do it. But we know it's. Maybe it's it's partly an academic discussion, saying, well, it's just because you have to do it doesn't make it value. Is it something that's helping the patient? Is it restoring their health or taking them along that path? And I have an example where it really stings when you say, okay, well, rationally, logically, that's waste. But I think what I hear you really emphasizing that point is to be careful that pointing out that fact doesn't disengage people or turn them off, and then they won't participate in improvement if they're disengaged, right?
Right. And in terms of value versus non-value, I think it comes back to sequencing again, our earlier conversation. You want to make sure that people's hearts and minds are engaged, that they understand the improvement portion, they're hearing the improvement portion, so that when they see what needs to be improved, it's not a matter of people throwing up fences to say, oh, no, that's value added, it's not non-value added, because they already get it. They already see what improvement is. But if their hearts and minds aren't captured, it's very difficult to see past that and see the improvement portion necessary. Like I can't remember what chapter it is, the balanced scorecard chapter, chapter 4. I mean, the balanced scorecard is a tool that's been out there and how to visualize metrics and visualize leading indicators and top problems. But when you look at an executive, just using them again, for example, anybody can make this mistake. Go up to a balanced scorecard and there's red and there's green. What do most people point out first?
Well, I mean, they focus on the red. Why is that red? What do we need to improve, right?
Right. So it's trying to flip that conversation so that learning to see is learning to see the green. wow, what did we do to get from here to here? So the executive or the leader or the manager can see the improvement portion and go back and thank the team, reward, recognize, so that they can eliminate more and more red. But if we don't learn how to see the positive, it's very difficult to eliminate the negative. Anybody can see the negative. Anybody can walk into an organization and say, well, that's red. You should be doing something differently. But it's very difficult to engage people in improvement activity.
Well, and I think you bring up I think a different topic about the red and the green. A lot of times those red and green boundaries are just completely arbitrary. So somebody will have a goal for some metric. The goal is 0.347. You're like, well, how in the heck does someone pick a goal of something to that many decimal points? Why is the goal 0.347? And they'll say something like, well, last year the goal was 0.35, and we want it to be a little bit better than it was last year. So that green and red is really dependent upon, if we didn't pick challenging goals, everything would be green. But I'm curious kind of your thoughts around setting those goals and maybe in the context of strategy deployment, which is a topic that you also address in the book, just kind of going beyond the balanced scorecard approach into strategy deployment. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, you definitely want to get all the numbers linked so that they all link back to the corporate goals and the annual strategy. And it's important to have things to the right decimal point. But more importantly is to have the right behaviors in place. So if we're going to have a goal that's that tight, we better have a master plan in place for how we're going to get there. And if that behavior of having a master plan and driving the annual plans, the monthly activities, the daily activities, if those aren't in place, what's the point in having a goal that's so stringent when you don't have a plan that's going to help you achieve the goal?
And I think, one of those goals that you could describe as stringent, you're in Pennsylvania. Paul O'Neill, who's done a lot of work in the Pittsburgh area, really talks a lot about setting a goal of zero patient harm. And I think that's a goal that people might get upset about. They don't want to think about the harm. They might think that zero harm isn't possible. But I think O'Neill raises really good points. And I think it comes back to this idea of mutual trust. If we're going to set a goal of zero harm, I think staff over time can learn to trust their leaders because the leaders are helping them with what they need to do the work. That leaders make sure that they've got the right staffing levels, the right process, the right environment, the right technology, and I think that builds trust. And then I think there's also trust in the other direction that, okay, when we're likely not going to achieve that goal this year of zero harm, and when we don't hit that goal, we're not going to blame the workers. We're not going to punish people or make them feel bad. I guess it's possible to accentuate the positive. We reduce harm by 50% this year. Now, next year, how do we reduce it another 50%? Is that, my question for you would be: is that positive? Is that positive enough? Is that too negative? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's kind of a catch-22. In the balanced scorecard chapter, I talk about the 6-year scorecard and setting world-class targets, which is Rodger's adaptation of the true north. And the reason behind that is if you go to an executive team and say, okay, next year our goal is 0 patient injuries or 0 employee injuries or 100% satisfaction, no matter what it might be. And I understand the difference between safety and satisfaction, but at the end of the year, when we don't achieve that goal, they may say, well, the system didn't work. This lean thing doesn't work. We didn't achieve our goal. So it's very important to have interim steps. Again, that's why we use the 6-year scorecard so that we can say at the end of the year, oh, this is working. We are moving towards world class. We are making a difference, and we're going to improve because the targets are already set. We're going to achieve this goal next year, and we know we can do it. But I think it's like I said at the beginning, I think it's a catch-22 because nobody wants to say, well, our goal this year is 20 serious events, serious patient safety events, and last year it was 30, and we're improving by X%. But I think in terms of culture and focusing on the positive, you've got to have an interim goal so that people can see that the system's working, so that all that energy can be put back into the system and we can achieve more and more. Because the reality is, I think there's probably organizations out there that are saying zero safety events, but they're not backing it up with a system, they're not backing it up with the culture, and they don't have a plan in place to get there.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of that happening. It becomes a slogan instead of something that everyone's really truly working together on. And again, I think that gets demoralizing. That diminishes the sense of trust. If people get excited and say, okay, our leaders are talking about patient safety, we all care about patient safety, we all come to work to do a good job and not harm anybody, this is exciting, and then to not get support, I think sometimes it seems like executives making some sort of promise. There might be a promise around, hey, we're going to listen to you. We're going to help you implement your ideas in a daily continuous improvement approach. If leaders say that and then don't follow through, that ends up, I think, morale ends up worse than it would have been if you had just never promised anything. And maybe I think that comes down to that question of trust. I think, sadly, a lot of healthcare professionals haven't been given a lot of good reasons to trust their leaders. And I think that's a really difficult starting point for lean.
Yeah, it is. And that's why, it's all about the culture, and it's all about mutual trust and respect, and how do we focus on the positive to get more positive, which will eliminate waste, versus focusing on the waste to eliminate waste, which it's hard to rally people behind until their hearts and minds are captured.
Yeah. So maybe one other thing we talk about here, I posted on the blog, for anyone who didn't see it, back on the January 27th, a guest post attributed to Steve. It's an excerpt from the book, a chapter, a section on daily huddles. Steve, maybe kind of summarize for the listeners, how would you explain a daily huddle to those who aren't doing them? And there's a lot of people in healthcare who don't have a daily huddle. How would you describe a huddle? Do you see, kind of second part of the question, sometimes people are doing huddles, but it's different than what we might do in a lean culture. How would you sort of give someone an introduction to lean daily huddles?
Well, I guess I'll start with what a lean daily huddle is not, because I've seen organizations that have taken different approaches, and it's been a top-down approach, and they're just saying, I want you to talk about this and this and this and this, and it just becomes another way for corporate communication, and that's not a huddle. And there's other places that think that lean is all about the huddle, because you can go to the huddle and you can see things happening, you can see things working, but if the things aren't working in between the huddles, then the huddle isn't really going to be that good. But it's a pretty good starting point. So in the book, I outline, you want to create the huddle prompts. What are the standing agenda items that you're going to add to each and every day, or that you're going to talk about each and every day? And it's not about the leader saying things, it's about the leader asking questions to try to really engage people. What are the positive things that are happening? What are some of the problems that we need to solve? At first, it's very transactional. It may be transactional until we get the right data in place to help support what we're trying to do. But as you add the other tools like a problem-solving sheet or an improvement sheet, then the huddles become much more transformational. Selecting a time and place for the huddle, that's honestly probably one of the most difficult things to do, it seems. And I've seen, executive teams, and I've seen frontline teams go back and forth. Oh, we're going to do this at noon. We're going to do it at 4:30. We're going to do it at 7 a.m. And what I found is you pretty much just have to pick a time and stick to it. And after a couple weeks, if it's not the best time, you can change that time, but just picking a time and sticking to it is important. And in the beginning, people are going to be reluctant to show up because they want to take care of patients. They want to make a difference, and they feel like a huddle is getting in the way of doing that. And until that culture really starts to shift, it takes a little bit for those behaviors to change. You want to introduce the standards. Why are we having a huddle? Why do we need to meet? What are the other tools that are going to be integrated into the huddle? What's this thing called a balanced scorecard, and how are we going to use it to visualize employee safety and patient safety? You want to share responsibilities for facilitating. So it's not just about the leader asking these questions every day and leading the huddle. You want others to lead it so that they know what it's like to walk in the leader's shoes. Even if it's only for 5 minutes, it's a different perspective. So people tend to talk about things differently and bring different things up at the huddle that they feel are important because they're in somebody else's shoes. You want to encourage and lead problem solving. So you don't want this to turn into a complaint session if you're asking about problems. So that's why I use the problem sheet to document what's happening. On the same token, as leaders are doing their rounds, or as you're seeing improvements happen, or as if people are learning about the improvement system, you want them to document their improvements so that they can share them at the huddle to get more improvements, and so that they can be shared around the rest of the organization. And daily reports are very, very necessary. We've got to get the right reports to help us with the right information. And in healthcare, I know there's a lot of older systems, older IT systems that hinder doing that. So sometimes it takes some time to do that. But it's very important to have facts so that we know what problems we're trying to solve and what improvements we're trying to make. And then we want to incorporate it into leaders' standard work. So some organizations, especially the ones using the transformation curve, will have tiered huddles so that if there's a couple frontline teams meeting, that may filter up to an executive style huddle so that they know, at the end of the executive huddle, they know where to go and see, they know who to ask for different problems, who to follow up with and say thank you based on the improvement system. So
yeah. Well, there's a lot of good tips there, and I think for the listeners, I think that is kind of an example of the detail that's there in the book. And I'll give you credit for, taking on the challenge of writing something that is, sort of a roadmap and a structure. For my book, for Lean Hospitals, that that's a big challenge. I didn't take on that challenge. My book is more of a primer about learning terms and, some of the techniques and the mindset and the philosophy. I think that does need to be followed up by a book that kind of gives you some pointers about more of a roadmap. So thank you for doing that. And maybe as we wrap up here, if you can just sort of briefly kind of explain, you chose to self-publish or kind of go through your own publishing imprint. Can you just share a little bit about that, and then let the listeners know how and where they can find and buy the book?
Well, it wasn't my intent to self-publish. I had a contract with a publishing house, but as I went through this, we were using it as a training manual, and I was sending it to others to use as a training manual. So all these graphics that I did throughout the book, they were all embedded. I was using Pages on my Mac computer, and the publisher wanted everything separated. They had a certain process, and for me to go back and backtrack and redo everything would have been just way too much work, and I wanted to put the focus on making sure the book is laid out correctly. Like you said, it's very, very nuts and bolts on how to implement a daily management system, or at least phase one of this transformation curve. So making sure that the right text is there with the right pictures. I didn't want anything to bump to another page, so I was very meticulous with this, and I just found that self-publishing was the easier way for me. And like you and I had a discussion a couple days ago, and you said, well, what if you changed this word or did that a little bit differently? Well, now I can do that. I can go back and change it because it's print on demand, which I think is great. I'm not going to make any significant improvements in the next couple months, or probably a year or two. I'll wait till the second release, but if there's minor things that I can change them, the best thing to do is just go on Amazon. It's available on Prime. It's also available Barnes & Noble, and you can get it there. I chose not to do an ebook just because the purpose of this is a training book. It's for a manual. It's to be taught in the Gemba or in a classroom, and it really wasn't meant to be taught behind a computer screen. So that's why I just chose to keep it as the print version. But self-publishing was very, very difficult. I wasn't expecting that. That's for sure. It took a lot longer to get out than I thought.
Yeah. Well, there are many pros and cons to it. I mean, like I said, you were able to maintain sort of complete creative control over the output, and like you said, printing in small batches. That's being able to do continuous improvement. That seems like the lean way to publish a lean book. So
yep.
It's good for you. But yeah, it is a lot of work. I have an appreciation for anyone who has ever taken a book to completion. So congratulations, and I hope the book does well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. Our guest has been Steve Leuschel. talking about his new book, Lean Culture Change, Using a Daily Management System. And if you go to the blog post for this episode, there will be links to the book and all sorts of other resources related to Steve's work. So, Steve, thanks again for joining us and telling us about your book today.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.